Did the makers of Ranger X merge with Sonic Team? How were their directors involved in the downfall of the Dreamcast? Was the music for Ranger X inspired by this Japanese superhero? All this, plus angry grannies and a man in a wig, as Gaming for Ages goes investigating! Yes, hello and welcome to Gaming for Ages' very own Investor Game Station. This is the hub where we explore our favourite retro titles. We'll be delving into their rich backstories to find out about the amazing people who made them, who they were, what they created, and the fascinating links between iconic games and the wider retro history. Today's wonderful subject is the 1993 Mega Drive Stormer Ranger X, the thinking man's run and gun. Released as episode Ranza in Japan, it's a clever and challenging shooter with a wonderful story, talented developers, an enigmatic composer, and links to some of the biggest names in the gaming world. So hold on to your Exo hats, because this is a good one! Let's start with the makers, GAO Entertainment. Except the story we're going to tell isn't actually about GAO at all, because the simple fact is that GAO only made one game before being taken over or morphing into another company, which we'll come to. No, the story of GAO is about where they came from and what happened next. And what happened before was Wolf Team. Wolf Team started in 1987. They made 40 odd games, including ones you'll know like Cobra Command, Road Blaster or Road Avenger, and Soul Feast. And Soul Feast was one of the Mega CD's launch titles. It became a packing game when it was released in the USA. Wolf Team is probably most famous for their Tales of series that they made with Namco towards the latter part of their history, and they were eventually dissolved into Namco Tel Studios in 2003. But our interest in Wolf Team is in 1993, when their parent, Telenet Japan, restructured all of their in-house teams and seemingly hacked off a bunch of their devs. As a result, its main Genesis programmers Toshio Toyota and Yukihiko Tani left to form GAO Entertainment. They took with them their regular graphics artist Toshio Yamamoto, and they made this single game, Ranger X. At Wolf Team, Toyota, Yamamoto and Tani, who by the way is crediting games as Bug Taru or Super Bugtaru or things like that, had made some of Wolf Team's bigger hits in the years immediately prior to GAO. They were the main programmers on the absolutely brilliant Granada and the absolutely not brilliant Final Zone. But a little side note on Granada, because Toyota was lead programmer for that just as he was for Ranger X, and both have these idiosyncrasies, these little bits of clever programming that when you sit them side by side feel like a fingerprint, a unique kind of developer ID. The enemy AI on Granada is brilliant for a simple top-down shooter. There's just an element to the enemies where you're not entirely sure what it is they're going to do. There's just that hint that they're genuinely thinking, and it's clever, and it massively adds to the gameplay. Now, there's not as much freedom for the enemies in Ranger X, but they do have, the bosses especially, a kind of randomness, or at least an eccentricity in their attack patterns. There's a way that both of these move, where you can feel that developer behind them and you can feel them wanting to make them do something different. It's a real ID. This was a team that wanted their games to have an identity. Interviewed in 1990 about Granada, Toyota references those extensive enemy algorithms, and then talking to Dengeti and Marikatsu Mega Drive in 93, he references specialized software tools that they developed themselves, and it shows. They also both have graphics tricks which were hugely impressive for the time. Granada's graphics are fairly basic in the main, but it does have some good parallax scrolling and it has these really good rotation and scaling effects on the bosses. Doubly impressive when you consider how early in the Mega Drive's life this game was released. And Ranger X is really known for its clever visuals, the wireframe interludes, the 3D style gimmicks on the backgrounds. I mean, it really is a bloody handsome game. In interview, Yamamoto, graphics guru, doesn't talk about aiming for graphical quality. He talks about wanting polish, and that's what these games have, a unique and high quality finish that makes them stand out. They clearly work together as a team closely, and they formed the core team for games all the way through to the mid-90s. But by the late 90s, programming teams were getting big and unwieldy. They were getting rapidly larger, and although Next Entertainment as a company would make games into the 2010s, the GAO team gradually dissipated Toyota isn't publicly credited on any game after D, while both Yamamoto and Bugtaru become just another name in larger teams. You can see them working together, but they would have been working with a lot of other people. Other than Ranger X, this little team's most notable game has to be Soleil, known as Crusader of Senti in the States or Ragnar Senti in Japan. It's considered variously to be anything from an absolute classic to the Mega Drive's answer to Zelda, all the way through to being a monotonous generic fantasy game. I mean, I think it's not a Zelda, but it is a good looking game, and it's definitely an overlooked quality title. You've also got to give an honourable mention to Cyber Speedway, just because it was known as Grand Chaser in Japan, and that's bloody hilarious. But although the story of the Gao Trio ends somewhere in the middle of Nex Entertainment, Nex itself has its own interesting story beyond them. It was initially formed with a merger of Gao Doing Software and tech firm Cybervision, and you can see they make electronics throughout the next 20 years, as well as developing or supporting on 20 odd games, working with SEGA and Namco and Capcom. The relationships they form are fascinating, but mysterious. In 1997, Nextech is bought by Sega. Company documents over the next few years show Sega's co-COO Satoshi Koyama as a director at Nextech. Koyama-san has an important place in the history of Sega. This is the one-time special advisor who, interestingly, also worked with Nintendo on the N64 lineup. On January 31st, 2001, he stood next to then COO of Sega, Hideki Sato, at the infamous Structural Reform Plan briefing. Sato-san revealed the news that Dreamcast production would be discontinued, the end of Sega's console-making era, and then Sato-san handed the mic to Tatsu Koyama to reveal Sega's plans to return to profitability. It's that same blueprint of third-party software production that continues today. It was a plan that echoed Nex itself. And although they carried on working with other partners as a third party, they were a wholly owned subsidiary of Sega. The exact history is hard to piece together, but Moby Games suggests they actually merged with Sonic Team in 1998. That would be weird, and game credits don't really reflect that actually happening, and it is something that's never mentioned in Sega or Sonic Team's own history. But maybe. In Nex Entertainment's own corporate history, they show a merger in 98 with a Sonic Co., a wholly owned subsidiary of Sega. And around this time, after the release of Sonic Adventure, there was a reshuffling of staff at Sonic Team, with many moving to work in the States. But this one looks like a red herring. GDRI claims that Sonic Co. refers to Sonic Software Planning, the dev team behind the Shining series. This is much more likely, as Nex were credited on several Shining games including Soul, Tears and Wind. And Sega Retro notes that Sonic Software Planning disappears from the Sega accounts in 98. Giant Bomb suggests SSP in fact became Camelot, who went on to work on Mario sports games, though perhaps this is just a movement of staff, including the former head of SSP, Hiroyuki Takahashi, whose brother ran Camelot. Whatever the situation at Nex, the links with Sega are fascinating. There are several titles where it's unclear what happened, and we'd love to know the details. In 2004, there was a lot of press attention for an upcoming game release called Steel Fang. Nex was said to be working on a sci-fi multiplayer shooting game that was going to be a collaboration not only with Sega, but also with Capcom. That's right, Sega and Capcom working together. Nex had worked with Capcom elsewhere on the Saturn port of Resident Evil and the Dreamcast version of Code Veronica, so the company links were definitely there. Demos of the game were released, testing took place, but the whole project seems to have been a mess, with no party seemingly in charge, and it collapsed without release. Perhaps my favourite little mystery though, found from records on Nex's own website on the Wayback Machine, is that they were commissioned to work on the highly renowned Sakura Wars, and yet there are no credits for them anywhere on the game or elsewhere. Satoshi Koyama seems to be a huge fan of Sakura Wars and crops up in multiple interviews around the early 2000s, talking it up as a franchise and promising more titles. Could he have had Nex in mind to develop them? If yes, their work was secret. So after the early years, the story of Nex is a common one. Small, independent-minded devs come together and gradually the industry gets bigger and more corporate. Individual names become less prominent, software houses rule the roost. Some thrive, some get cast aside. It's not a tragedy, they worked on some good games in their time. But that individuality, that personality of the games like Granada and Ranger X gets lost. Nex bought the company back from Sega in 2003 through a management buyout and went independent again, producing games for another decade before eventually winding up in 2014. But they didn't make another classic. They didn't make another game with individuality like Ranger X. So theirs is a story with deep roots and many branches, and though some fruits fell to the ground unnoticed, the ones we picked up were bloody tasty. Alright, so now we turn to the music, and oh baby, this stuff is a delight. The Ranger X is stacked with dramatic 90s chiptunes, and that lead track is literally one of the best things you'll hear on the Mega Drive. Now look, I may be applying a bit of retro ears to this thing because back in the day, Mean Machines called these tracks patchy and dull. Sega Power gave them a measly 5, but CMVG, our trusty CMVG, called them dead good thumping tracks. And more recently, Fact Magazine featured this very game in its best Sega Genesis tracks you've never heard. And with that, we'd agree. The fascinating thing about this music is that it was created by just one guy, Yoshinobu Hiraiwa, who created the huge roster of 23 tracks. Even at the time, people thought that this was too much for one guy to take on, and he disagreed, and humbly so do we. They sound polished, adventurous, flamboyant, dark, energetic. They sound incredibly accomplished on the Mega Drive, and they sound like the work of a deeply experienced maker of game music. But Hiraiwa is not that guy. He only ever worked on a handful of games, and Ranger X is the only one that gave him any notoriety. What he is an incredibly active and accomplished composer. He's worked on everything from adverts and concerts and pop music, and he's been doing it since the 1980s, and he's still going, covering things all the way from artists like U3 and Anna Banana to products like the Toyota Tercel, Nichirio Daily Bread, Kit Kats. The thing is, this is not your typical game developer. This guy started out with the Tenjo Sajiki, a Japanese theatre troupe known for their folkloric productions and their grotesque eroticism. Now he sits on a backlog, a bio of thousands of works, and yet only this handful of games, and only this one that people know about. What he does now? He posts pictures of flowers and noodles and sunsets and Shibu. The thing is, the reason we love him is Hiraiwa is 100% representative of this game. Like Gao, he emerged for this one. He created this one brilliant soundtrack and then essentially disappeared. And like Toshio Toyota and Yamamoto, he was determined to make something unique. He told Dengeki and Marikatsu Mega Drive at the time that game music can all sound the same, and he didn't want to do that. He went for dark, surreal. He went for progressive rock on a Mega Drive, and he delivered it. He made this one brilliant game soundtrack, and then essentially he never did it again. So that's it. That's the story of Ranger X, of Gao, of Nex, of the fantastic Hiraiwa-san. We hope it's been as interesting to hear as it has been for us, digging into the game. These videos are research driven, so always say if you hear something that's not right, and we're happily corrected. And we try diligently to credit our sources, so let us know if we've missed a name. Best of all, if you have extra gems about this little bit of retro history, we'd love to hear them in comments or on socials. And of course, we'd love to link up with the wider community, so please do subscribe and keep in touch. Until next time, keep gaming.